everyone! In this unit of the Introduction to Cultural Anthropology, I'm going to talk to you about life transitions, symbols, and rituals. There are two major life transitions that all humans experience. And if you are here with me today, you've gone through one of them. Although you have no memory of it, you probably have a good sense of how you were born. And some people feel very strongly about birth and reproduction. In the print you see here, it's an engraving made by a Swiss artist in the 16th century, and you see a woman giving birth, assisted by midwives and other women. In the meanwhile, men are gazing at the stars. But now take a look at this other medieval painting. What do you notice? Take a close look. Someone is giving birth, but who is giving birth? So this medieval guy giving birth is not alone. The medical literature estimates that between 20 to 80% of males, depending on the study and the method, will experience pregnancy-like symptoms. And in 1865, an anthropologist called Edward Burnett Taylor wrote about this phenomenon in a book entitled Researches into the Early History of Mankind and the Development of Civilization. And the title gives you a sense of the kind of anthropology that Taylor was doing. In a chapter called Some Remarkable Customs, Taylor wrote about a set of ritualized practices that he called hatching or couvade. The term couvade is from French and it means hatching or brooding. And in his armchair anthropological research, Taylor found variants of this couvade practice worldwide of men experiencing and acting like they were pregnant and giving birth. So here's how Taylor described this phenomenon in the late 19th century. He writes, "The father, on the birth of the child, makes a ceremonial pretense of being the mother, being nursed and taken care of, and performing other rites such as fasting, abstaining from certain kinds of foods and occupations. And these practices involved men undertaking food and activity restrictions during their wives' or their partners' pregnancies, as if they were mimicking pregnancy." Okay, remember we talked about the early school of anthropology was really into stages of civilization and social evolution. And for Taylor, who was part of that group, the couvade was a feature of what he considered to be lower societies, people who he thought were unable to understand causality, the basic facts of reproduction, and fundamental biological phenomena. In fact, Taylor described the couvade as, quote, "the laughingstock of mankind." And half a century later, your friend Bronislaw Malinowski, you remember him from the Trobriand Islands, he observed couvade practices in the Trobriand Islands where he was conducting ethnographic fieldwork, a custom in which the husband has to take over the symptoms of postnatal illness and disability, while the wife goes about the ordinary business of life. But Malinowski, differently from Taylor, saw the couvade as serving a necessary biological function because a family, he believed, should consist of both mother and father, and so the couvade practice worked to accentuate the child's need of a father. You see, this is what is considered to be a functionalist approach to anthropology, meaning that cultural practices and institutions are understood to have a basic function, to serve a purpose. So in the following decades, throughout the 20th century, other anthropologists observed a huge variety of couvade practices worldwide. In some societies, the father retreated to bed and experienced birth-giving pains. But there were many other versions of the couvade. There were couvades in which the father observed diet restrictions, different simulations of birth. There were various kinds of rituals. And the couvade happened in some cases before birth, and in some cases after, and in other cases both before and after. So there have been many different theories of what the couvade does. at the symbolic level, at the cultural level, at the political level. So one theory is that the Kuvad is a symbol of a passage from mother right to father right. The second theory is that it helps to express a father-child relationship, particularly in societies where the paternal bond or recognition is weak or insecure. The third one is a Freudian version of a theory of the envy of the womb, whereby men's envy of women's reproductive functions, their ability to create life, leads them to claim their superiority through other fields, and the Kuvad is where they re-establish control over biological functions. A fourth interpretation is that the Kuvad is a ritual of passage whereby men become fathers, and we'll talk about this at the end of this unit. The fifth theory is that in societies where parents are believed to also be spiritually connected to the child, the Kuvad is really a ritual about protecting the child from various sources of harm. The parents are handling this double creation of birth being both material, you're born through a physical body, through a physiological, biological process, but it's also spiritual. It's imbued with meaning, and some of this meaning has to do with a transcendental component to our experience of being human. And so the Kuvad people have written, it's really about body and soul coming together, these dimensions coming together, the material and the spiritual. And spiritual birth, the idea of the body and the soul coming together, and this can take very different forms depending on the cultural and religious context, of course, can take much, much longer than physical birth, which sometimes people understand as occurring just within a few hours. So let's stay with this last set of hypotheses for a while. The idea that Kuvad is a ritual of passage, and the idea that it brings together material and spiritual understandings of birth. So my first question for you is, thinking about your own birth, what do you identify as the material aspects of it, and what do you see as the more spiritual or cultural components? So anthropologists have written about the Kuvad as expressing and constructing a symbolic relationship between cultural and natural phenomena. And you can think of it as a structure in which birth is to the Kuvad, as the natural is to the spiritual. You can also expand it as men are to women, as the natural is to the spiritual, as birth is to the Kuvad. And even further, you can think about the contrast between male, female, productive, destructive, active, and passive, and so forth. And this is a structuralist way of thinking about it. But let me give you a concrete example. And I'm drawing from a study conducted by an anthropologist called Laura Rival. And she worked with Huaorani people. They're an indigenous community living in the Ecuadorian Amazon. And Rival observed that towards the end of their pregnancy, the expectant couple stopped eating fish and also stopped eating most types of meat. The father avoids going out to hunt. He no longer enters the forests. He stays home as much as possible on a hammock, and he sleeps alone. And Rival asked the Huaorani about these restrictions in diet and activities and what it meant. And over, they explained to her that the newborn child is still one flesh with the mother and with the father, and needs to be protected from wasting away. And so the parents' food restrictions and activities restrictions are believed to make the baby stronger and more vigorous. And people had different ideas about the foods that had to be avoided, but everyone stressed that the diet of the expectant parents differed from that of other regular people in the community. And that everything that the mother observed, the father also had to observe. So if a doctor prescribed pregnancy vitamins, the father also would take them. Birth for Huaorani people were often communal events, and the father, with the help of the mother's own mother, took on the role of a midwife. The father learned to wrap the placenta in leaves at the end of the birth and then buried it underneath a fast-growing tree in the forest. And it is another practice that helped the baby grow vigorous and strong. Huaorani people understood that a child is formed by an equal amount of male and female substances, and also that a child is not really born when they leave the womb, but birth occurs after the parents have completed all of their kuvad restrictions and when the maternal grandparent has given the child a name. And so birth is not an event. You're not born and then born, but rather it's a process of gradual incorporation where the newborn babies are integrated progressively into the communal household and into its shared economies, practices, social bonds, and rituals. And the idea is that to be human for Hurani people is to be part of this web of relationships. To be human is to share with others, to share substances, to share work, to share responsibility, to share space. As a child becomes this fully fledged person, the father and the mother also become fully fledged parents in the social sense of being a couple that exists within the wider matrilocal family. So if you return to this earlier contrast that we posited between birth and kuvad, and natural and spiritual, which you can also expand into a contrast of women are to men, as natural is to spiritual, as birth is to the kuvad. One way that people have understood the kuvad is that the father mimics the mother's natural biological processes, adopting her restrictions on food, activities, and work. And these are practices that, why does the mother do that? Well, obviously, she needs to adapt to the biological transformations of pregnancy and birth. And this is how anthropologists thought about this kuvad phenomenon for a long time. Okay, let's pause here for a second. What do you think about this last line of argumentation? Does it make sense? Does it sound about right? Or is there something a little off? So there is a big problem with this interpretation. And the problem is that it naturalizes the mother-child bond. So when a woman observes food restrictions during pregnancy and birth, anthropologists thought, oh well, that's perfectly rational. That's just what women do. They undergo biological changes, they give birth, and they have to respond to that by adopting different practices. But when the father did the same, then that was seen as weird, as confusing, as the father confusing the natural mother-child bond for his own. And in general, this has been a problem of how anthropologists have studied the kuvad over the 20th century, is that they have really paid much more attention to unpacking the father's behavior as a subject of study, but they took women's ritual restrictions and practices around procreation and birth for granted. They naturalized them. So if that's a problem, and I think it is a problem because it naturalizes women's behavior and biology while taking for granted and presuming that men's practices are creative and cultural and then women's practices are less so, and okay, so then how do we think about the kuvad? So I think a good way to go about it is to think of the kuvad as being about three people being transformed into new roles that they hold in their community. So we need to see both paternal and maternal and parental roles in general as societal roles, as societal practices. These are cultural forms that are really embedded in and shaped by broader social contexts. The kuvad is a big ritual of co-parenthood in which people claim publicly to be parents, and they are incorporated into the wider social world in that new role. Okay, I've talked about ritual a lot, and now I would like to transition our conversation to thinking about ritual in general in anthropology. So my question for you is, what do you think a ritual is? What are the things that you consider to be a ritual? What are rituals in which you have participated? And what do they all have in common? There's a broader anthropological definition of ritual, and that's that ritual is a repetitive, symbolic behavior. It's structured, it's collective, and it's transformative. And anthropologists identified different types of rituals depending on their intended purpose, its recurrence, and its basic structure. Here are some examples. There are seasonal rituals that marking the passage of time and recurrent changes. Things that happen over and over again, repeatedly, every day or every year. There are rituals of passage that are big life cycle and life transition ritual, and you can think of the Kuvad as a ritual of passage. There are rituals that help to heal, to purify, to exercise, or to protect, and we call them rituals of affliction. There are rituals you do to read the future, and these are called divinatory rituals. There are fertility rituals that bring upon birth and abundance and growth, and these can also be seasonal rituals or they can be connected to the life cycle. And then there is rituals of sacrifice, and this can be daily sacrifice or they can be event-based, they can be situational sacrifice. So in the early 20th century, a French-Dutch-German ethnographer called Arnold van Gennep, he came up with the basic structure for rituals of passage, and he claimed that you could find variants of the same structures pretty much anywhere in the world and pretty much in all life cycle rituals. It's pretty basic abstract structures, but I want us to think about it just as a starting point to start to unpack some of the things that we do in our world that we might think of as being ritualized collective practices. So Van Gennep's structure had 3 phases. The first phase is separation. The ritual participants suspend their involvement in everyday life and they are physically separated or secluded, they're taken away. The second phase is liminality. In the liminal phase, the ritual participants lose their social identity. They might play out the structures of everyday life, but reinverting them. Everything is upside down. All the notions of identity, time, and space, everything is suspended and mixed up. The third phase is reintegration, and this is where the ritual participants are reintroduced into everyday life, but with a new social role. The society's norms and structures have also been reaffirmed. So to make a ritual, we need people, and we also need symbols. So look around you for a second, and can you identify a couple of symbols? And let's think about symbols for a second. There's an American philosopher called Charles Sanders Peirce, also another 19th to 20th century person, and he thought that symbols are just a category of signs. He thought there's like 3 different types of signs. You have indexes. The index is something that indicates it's directly influenced by the object it represents. Concrete example, a thermometer. It indicates temperature through a direct relationship with the temperature that it marks. Or the sound of a tree that falls. The sound indexes the falling of the tree, and it is also caused by the tree falling down. The second category is the icon. The icon has a specific property in common with their object. Think of a map or a no-smoking sign. And finally, symbols. Symbols, according to Peirce, are arbitrary signs. There is no relationship between the object and what they indicate. They are just conventionally, societally agreed upon. The point here is that symbols don't mean anything unless someone is doing the meaning making and interpreting it. And so you always need an interpreter and a reader. Are you so sure about it? Maybe some of you have heard of Ferdinand de Saussure. He worked in the field of semiotics, and he talked about the sign or a signifier and the object, which is that which is signified. And Peirce here added the idea of the interpretant, and this is just someone who reads and comprehends the symbol. Okay, the main point here is that symbols and what they mean is really about what is collectively agreed upon. It's completely arbitrary. And in the 1960s, anthropologists became obsessed with symbolic approaches. So for example, a North American anthropologist called Clifford Geertz argued that symbols like words, customs, rituals are publicly shared, and culture itself is embodied in these symbols. And what is the task of the anthropologist? Well, the anthropologist is the person who can go and read these symbols and interpret them, like reading through the pages of a book. And so symbols, these are arbitrarily agreed upon signifiers. They are really so fundamental to rituals and how rituals work. And rituals don't just reflect the existing reality or status quo or society, but people have argued rituals produce new subjects and new relationships and new collectives. Okay, so think about a ritual in which you participated and think about the kind of symbols that were used and what they meant. And now try to reconstruct what did people do in this ritual, and could you interpret the ritual following Van Gennep's structure of 3 phases? And were you in any way transformed through this ritual? In this last part of the lecture, I want to bring together the part about the Kuvad and birth and ritual. And I'm going to do that by drawing from work written by an anthropologist called Alma Gottlieb. This was based in research that she conducted in the 1980s with Bang people living in the rainforest of Côte d'Ivoire in West Africa. So remember, while early anthropologists marveled at the weirdness of the Kuvad, they took for granted women's child-rearing practices. But birth and child-rearing everywhere in the world are never just simply common sense things that people do. And here's where the anthropological perspective comes in, seeing how these everyday practices are shaped by broader cultural understandings. Gottlieb found out that in the religious world of Bang people in Côte d'Ivoire, there are 2 parallel and simultaneous worlds. There is a world of spirits called Ru and the world of living people. And spirits live in an invisible spirit neighborhood called Rugbe. But Rugbe is not an afterlife. Rugbe is more like an intermediary point. People can move in and out of Rugbe. And so when a Bang baby is born, he or she is known to simply have returned from Rugbe. A baby for Bang people is a person who has lived previously, has died, has traveled to Rugbe, spent some time there, and then returned as a different person. And this belief has huge implications for child rearing. So when babies are born, they're still partially in Rugbe, and they have to still go through a pretty long process of leaving Rugbe and becoming a living person. And all sorts of rituals help this process along. For example, the maternal grandmother applies a little ointment to help speed up the umbilical cords drying out and falling. She also makes a grass necklace, which the baby will wear day and night until the necklace falls off. But for the first week after birth in particular, the baby is not fully in the living world yet, but hasn't fully left Rugbe. And the relatives and the parents try to convince the child to choose to stay in this world and not to return to Rugbe. One way that they go about it is because in the Rugbe world, the spirits are known to have money and wealth. So the relatives of the newborn baby adorn the baby with valuable jewels. Otherwise, if they don't do that, the Rugbe parents might snatch the baby back. Another belief about Ru spirits, the Ru spirits live in a cosmopolitan, multilingual world, and the spirits are known to speak many languages. And so when babies are born, they're believed to be born with that ability, infinite ability for language. And eventually they lose that ability over time until they will only understand their parents' language or languages. And because of this, Bang adults are constantly talking to their babies. And even before the babies are able to speak for themselves, adults will have entire conversations where they impersonate the baby. So an adult would ask a baby a question, and another adult would talk back, impersonating the baby, speaking as if the baby was speaking. So worldwide, there are many different ways in which adults engage with the babbling of babies. Even the similar practice of child rearing or of relating to a baby can hold a very different meaning depending on the broader context that shapes that practice. I'm drawing from this example from Gottlieb's work because I want us to go back to thinking of birth as a liminal stage in a ritual of passage. In this case, the liminal phase is from a spirit world into that of a living person if you exist in a Bang cosmology. And this liminal phase can be very long. So the baby's reincorporation into a society with a new role as a fully fledged Bang person is made possible through different ritual practices. And this also takes place through everyday practices of care and parenting, like specific ways of talking to babies, for example. So some of the big takeaways here are, first, to reconsider some of the ways in which we naturalize certain aspects of birth and parenthood. The second point is to think of rituals as collective, structured, repetitive behaviors that transform the people who participate in them. And the third one is to think of some of the kind of basic aspects of human life, like being born, as being a ritual practice, and a practice that can take different forms in different cultural contexts. And one implication of this is that if we're not simply born as people, but undergo a process of socialization that can take different forms, the family is also an institution that doesn't just exist, but has to be made. And we're going to talk about that in the next units of this course. Well, thank you for listening to me today, and I look forward to seeing you all very soon.